I remember the rain most of all, how it drummed against the bedroom window that October night, each drop a soft percussion that filled the spaces between our words. The room was dim, lit only by the amber glow of the street lamp filtering through half-closed blinds, casting long shadows across the unmade bed where we lay, side by side, but not touching. Not yet. Julian had been talking about a song he'd heard on the radio driving over. Something about how music could transport you back to who you used to be, before life taught you to be careful with your heart. His voice was different now than it had been in college. Deeper, weathered by years I hadn't been part of. 23 years had passed since we'd shared a dorm room, since we'd stayed up until dawn arguing about literature and dreams and all the ways we thought we'd change the world. I kept my eyes on the ceiling, listening to him breathe beside me. The gold band on my ring finger caught the light every time I gestured, a constant reminder of the life waiting for me downstairs. Clara would be asleep by now, the children too. The house settled around us in its familiar quiet, but something felt different tonight. Charged, as if the air itself was holding its breath. We'd been talking for hours about nothing and everything. About the band he used to love that broke up. About my job at the insurance office, how I'd never imagined myself there at 22. About regrets that we carried like stones in our pockets. Too heavy to examine, but too precious to discard. The kind of conversation you can only have with someone who knew you when you still believed you could become anyone. Julian shifted beside me, and I felt the mattress dip slightly. I could sense him turning toward me, though I kept staring upward, afraid that if I looked at him directly, I might see something I wasn't ready to acknowledge. The rain continued its steady rhythm, and in that soft percussion I heard all the years that had passed, all the silence that had grown between us like a living thing. Then he moved. It was such a small gesture, barely perceptible in the dim light. His hand lifted from where it had been resting on his chest, hovering for just a moment in the space between us. I felt rather than saw his fingers reaching across that careful distance, trembling slightly as they found my cheek. The touch was gentle, questioning. His fingertips traced the line of my jaw with a tenderness that made my chest tighten. It lasted maybe 3 seconds, maybe less. But in that brief contact, something that I had been holding closed for decades suddenly opened, like a door I'd forgotten I had the key to. I closed my eyes and felt 23 years collapse into nothing. Felt the weight of every careful choice, every safe decision, every time I'd looked away from what I really wanted. His touch was both an ending and a beginning, the period at the end of one sentence and the first word of another I wasn't sure I had the courage to write. When his hand fell away, we lay there in the renewed silence, the rain still falling, both of us breathing a little too carefully. Neither of us spoke. There was nothing to say that wouldn't change everything, and everything to say that we couldn't bear to voice. In that moment, I understood that some truths are too large for words, too fragile for the open air. I opened my eyes and finally turned to look at him. Julian's face was soft in the amber light, his eyes holding mine with a gentleness that felt like coming home and like free fall all at once. We stayed like that, looking at each other across the small distance between us, while the rain continued to fall and the house held us in its quiet embrace. That single touch, that was where it all began to unravel, and where, without knowing it yet, I began to find my way back to myself. To understand what Julian's touch meant, you have to understand the life I had built. The careful architecture of days that looked, from the outside, like everything a man of 48 should want. My house sits on Maple Street, third one from the corner, with its neat white picket fence and flower beds that Clara tends with methodical precision every spring. The mortgage is manageable. The neighborhood is quiet. Children ride bicycles on sidewalks that actually get swept, and on summer evenings you can hear the distant hum of lawn mowers creating that suburban symphony of contentment. From my kitchen window, I can see the Hendersons walking their golden retriever each morning at exactly 7:15. Mrs. Chun waters her roses while her husband backs their silver sedan out of the driveway. These are the rhythms that have governed my days for over 2 decades. Predictable, safe, suffocating. I work at Hartwell Insurance, 4th floor, corner desk near the window that overlooks the parking lot. I process claims and update policy information and attend meetings about quarterly projections. My colleagues know me as the reliable one, the guy who never calls in sick, who remembers everyone's birthday and brings donuts on Fridays. They have no idea that I spend most of my day staring at that parking lot, wondering how I became the kind of person who finds comfort in actuarial tables. Clara and I have been married for 22 years. Our wedding photos line the hallway leading to the stairs, a gallery of moments frozen in silver frames. There we are cutting the cake, laughing at something her father said. There we are dancing, her white dress spreading around us like spilled moonlight. My smile in those pictures is wide and genuine. The smile of a young man who believed that love was simply a decision you made and then lived with. The children came next. Michael, now 19 and away at college, studying business because it seemed practical. Sarah, 17, who spends most of her time in her room with headphones on, lost in whatever music helps her make sense of being almost grown up. They are good kids, responsible kids. They hug me when they leave for school and ask how my day was over dinner. But sometimes I catch them watching me with a kind of careful concern, as if they can sense something beneath the surface that even I haven't fully acknowledged. Our family vacations are documented in another set of frames scattered throughout the living room. Disney World when the children were small, my forced enthusiasm for roller coasters captured in pixelated digital prints. The Grand Canyon, where I stood at the rim and felt nothing but the obligation to appreciate natural wonder. A beach house rental in North Carolina, where Clara built sandcastles with Sarah while I sat in a folding chair, reading paperback novels and trying to ignore the way other families seem to inhabit their happiness so naturally. In every photograph, my smile is present but hollow. It reaches my mouth, but never quite makes it to my eyes. Clara's happiness is more genuine, though even hers carries a subtle weight. The look of someone who loves deeply but wonders sometimes if that love is fully returned. The evenings are the hardest. After dinner, after the dishes are done and homework is checked, and the day's small crises are resolved, we settle into our separate routines. Clara reads in her chair by the window, usually historical fiction or memoirs of women who overcame impossible odds. I flip through channels on the television, never really watching anything, just letting the voices fill the silence between us. We are kind to each other. We share information about our days and coordinate schedules and discuss the children's needs with the efficiency of business partners. But we do not touch unless it serves a purpose. We do not laugh at each other's jokes unless they are genuinely funny. We do not fight because there is nothing urgent enough to fight about. Sometimes, late at night when everyone else is asleep, I stand in my study looking at the guitar that leans against the bookshelf. I bought it in college, dreamed of writing songs that would mean something to someone. The strings are loose now, probably beyond tuning. Dust gathers on its face like neglect made visible. I used to imagine myself playing small clubs, traveling from city to city with nothing but music and possibility. Now I can barely remember the chords to the 3 songs I once knew by heart. Clara knows about the guitar, about the dreams I used to have. Early in our marriage, she would sometimes ask if I missed playing, if I ever thought about trying again. I would tell her that music was a young man's fantasy, that real life required more practical ambitions. She stopped asking eventually, but I catch her looking at that guitar sometimes, and I wonder if she sees it as a symbol of everything I gave up, or everything we never quite became together. The truth is that I chose this life deliberately. Not the music, not the adventure, not the uncertainty of following something that felt authentic but offered no guarantees. I chose stability over passion, security over risk, the approval of others over the whispered demands of my own heart. I told myself that this was maturity, that this was what responsible men do. But responsibility had become a weight I carried everywhere. In my shoulders, in my chest, in the space behind my eyes where headaches lived like permanent residents. I moved through each day like someone walking underwater, everything muffled and distant, requiring enormous effort to appear normal. The weekends were perhaps the cruelest. Saturday mornings meant lawn care, The methodical back and forth of the mower across grass that never seemed to need cutting, but somehow always did. I would edge the walkways and trim the bushes while Clara worked in her garden, both of us moving through these domestic rituals like actors who had long ago memorized their parts but forgotten why the play mattered. Sunday dinners were family obligations dressed up as traditions. Clara would cook roast beef or chicken, something that required hours of preparation and filled the house with the kind of smells that were supposed to mean home. The children would emerge from their rooms, Michael visiting from college when he could, Sarah temporarily liberated from her headphones. We would sit around the table and discuss safe topics: school, work, the weather, plans for the upcoming week. But even in these moments of supposed togetherness, I felt like I was watching from outside myself, observing this middle-aged man who nodded at appropriate times and asked follow-up questions and smiled when someone shared good news. I wondered if they could see through the performance, if Clara especially knew that I was only partially present, that some essential part of me had been held in suspension for so long I'd forgotten it existed. The guilt was constant but manageable. I told myself that plenty of marriages settled into companionship rather than passion, that raising children and maintaining a household and building a stable life together was its own form of love, even if it didn't feel like the love songs had promised. Clara seemed content enough, involved in her book club and volunteer work at the hospital. She had friends who called in the evenings and made her laugh in ways I hadn't managed to in years. Sometimes I wondered if she was lonely too, if she also lay awake at night thinking about roads not taken. But we had developed such careful habits around our emotional distance that asking would have felt like a violation of some unspoken treaty. We were both committed to making this work, to being good parents and responsible citizens, and a couple that others could point to as stable, successful, worthy of admiration. I had convinced myself that this was enough, that contentment was a reasonable substitute for joy, that security was more valuable than excitement, that the alternative to this well-constructed life was chaos and selfishness and the kind of regret that came from wanting too much. And then Julian came back, carrying with him the scent of rain and possibility, reminding me of who I used to be before I learned to be so careful with my life. Before I understood that happiness was something other people expected you to perform rather than something you actually felt. Before I forgot that there might be other ways to live, other versions of myself I had never allowed to breathe. The message came on a Tuesday afternoon in early September. I was at my desk, half-heartedly reviewing a claim for water damage when my phone buzzed. The name on the screen stopped me mid-sentence: Julian Marsh. I hadn't seen that name in my contacts for over a decade, hadn't thought about him in months, maybe longer. The text was simple, almost cautious. "Hey Nate, I'm back in town for a few weeks. Photography project. Would love to catch up if you have time. Hope you're well." I stared at those words for a long time, feeling something shift in my chest. Julian had been my roommate junior and senior year, back when I still played guitar at open mic nights and believed that passion was more important than practicality. We had been inseparable then, the kind of friends who could communicate with glances across crowded rooms, who stayed up until dawn talking about books and music and all the ways we planned to avoid becoming our parents. After graduation, he had moved to Portland to work for a small magazine, while I stayed local, took the job at Hartwell, married Clara. We exchanged Christmas cards for a few years, emails that grew shorter and less frequent. Eventually, the distance did what distance does, and we simply faded from each other's lives, the way college friends often do when one chooses adventure and the other chooses stability. I set the phone down without responding, but I couldn't concentrate on the claim forms. Julian Marsh. Even his name carried echoes of who I used to be. Reminded me of afternoons spent in coffee shops debating whether Kerouac was a genius or just self-indulgent, evenings when we would drive aimlessly through back roads with the windows down, talking about girls and dreams and the books we were going to write someday. That night at dinner, Clara mentioned that Mrs. Henderson had asked about our plans for Thanksgiving, and I nodded absently, still thinking about Julian's message. Sarah was telling us about some drama in her advanced placement history class, but her words felt distant, filtered through the strange nostalgia that had settled over me like fog. I waited until Thursday to respond. Coffee sounds good. How about Saturday morning? Brewster's on Main Street, 10 a.m. His reply came within minutes. Perfect. Looking forward to it. Saturday arrived gray and drizzle soft, the kind of late summer morning that hints at autumn. I told Clara I was meeting an old college friend, and she smiled the polite, distant smile she reserved for information that required acknowledgement but not engagement. She was deep in planning mode for Sarah's upcoming senior year, college applications and scholarship deadlines consuming most of her attention. I arrived at Brewster's 10 minutes early and chose a table near the window, watching other patrons come and go while I nursed black coffee and tried to manage the unexpected nervousness in my stomach. 23 years was a long time. People changed. I had certainly changed, had become someone I probably wouldn't have recognized at 22. When Julian walked through the door, I knew him immediately. Older, of course. His dark hair was threaded with silver now, and lines mapped the corners of his eyes. But his walk was the same, that easy confidence that had always made him seem more comfortable in his own skin than the rest of us. He wore a faded denim jacket over a gray t-shirt and carried a worn leather bag slung across his shoulder. He spotted me and smiled, and for a moment I was 22 again, watching him navigate the campus coffee shop between classes. Then he was at my table, and I was standing, and we were embracing awkwardly, trying to figure out the appropriate level of familiarity for men our age who had once been closer than brothers. We sat down and looked at each other across the small table, both of us grinning a little sheepishly. He looked good, weathered but vital in a way that suggested he had been living more than surviving. There was something in his eyes that I envied immediately, a brightness that spoke of choices made for reasons other than fear. We began tentatively, exchanging the basic information that fills the gaps between past and present. He told me about Portland, about the magazine job that had led to freelance photography, about traveling to document small towns across the Pacific Northwest. I talked about Hartwell Insurance, about Clara and the children, about the house on Maple Street. Safe territories, the kind of conversation you might have with any acquaintance you hadn't seen in years. But gradually, as we ordered second cups of coffee and the morning wore on, we began to find our old rhythm. Julian made a joke about my tie, the same kind of gentle teasing he used to do when I got too serious about something. I found myself laughing in a way that felt rusty from disuse, and suddenly we were back to being ourselves, or the selves we used to be. He told me about a series he was working on, photographing abandoned buildings in small industrial towns, trying to capture what he called the dignity of decay. The way he described it, his eyes lighting up as he talked about composition and light, reminded me of how he used to get excited about films or books that moved him. That passionate engagement with beauty that I had once shared and had somehow misplaced along the way. I found myself watching his hands as he spoke, noting how they moved to emphasize his words, the same gestures I remembered from late-night conversations in our dorm room. When he asked about my work, I tried to make insurance claims sound interesting and failed miserably. But Julian listened as if my answer mattered, nodding with the kind of attention that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't experienced in years. The morning stretched into afternoon without either of us noticing. Other customers came and went, the staff changed shifts, and still we talked. About music, about books we had read, about people we had known in college, and what had become of them. Julian had kept in touch with more of our old friends than I had, and his stories filled in gaps I hadn't realized I'd been curious about. When I finally looked at my watch, it was past 2 o'clock. I had promised Clara I would be home in time to help with groceries, to maintain the weekend routines that kept our household running smoothly. But I was reluctant to break the spell of this conversation, to return to the careful choreography of my regular life. Julian walked me to my car, and we stood there for a moment in the parking lot, neither of us quite ready to end this unexpected reunion. He gave me his number and told me to call if I wanted to grab dinner sometime. I said I would, though I wasn't sure if I meant it or if it was just something polite to say. Driving home, I felt oddly energized, more awake than I had been in months. The familiar streets looked different somehow, more vivid. as if Julian's presence had adjusted the contrast on everything around me. I caught myself humming a song I hadn't thought about in years, one we used to play on repeat in our dorm room while studying for finals. At home, Clara was organizing coupons at the kitchen table, preparing for her weekly grocery expedition. She looked up when I came in and asked how it had gone. "Fine," I told her. "Nice to catch up with an old friend." She nodded and returned to her coupons, and I realized that I had no way to explain what had actually happened in that coffee shop. The way Julian's reappearance had stirred something I thought I had successfully buried. That evening, after dinner and dishes and the quiet settling of the house into its nighttime rhythms, I found myself standing in my study, looking at that dusty guitar. For the first time in years, I wondered if the strings might still hold a tune. Julian called 3 days later. He was downtown, had finished an afternoon shoot, wondered if I wanted to grab a beer. I found myself saying yes before I had time to think about whether it was wise, before I could consider how to explain another impromptu meeting to Clara. We met at a small bar I had never been to, the kind of place with exposed brick walls and local musicians playing acoustic sets on Tuesday nights. Julian looked at home there in a way that made me acutely aware of my button-down shirt and pressed khakis, the uniform of suburban respectability that had become my second skin. But as we talked over pints of local beer, that self-consciousness faded. Julian had always possessed this quality, the ability to make you forget about the persona you thought you needed to maintain and simply be yourself. Within an hour, I was telling him about the guitar gathering dust in my study, about the songs I used to write, about dreams I hadn't spoken aloud in decades. He listened without judgment, without the polite but distant attention that most conversations in my current life required. When I mentioned feeling disconnected from the person I used to be, he nodded as if this were the most natural confession in the world. He told me about his own struggles, the years of uncertainty that came with choosing a less conventional path, the loneliness of always moving, always being the outsider looking in. These conversations became a pattern, not frequent enough to disrupt the careful balance of my home life, but regular enough that I began to look forward to them with an intensity that surprised me. Julian would text, usually spur of the moment, and if I could manage it, I would meet him. Sometimes for coffee, sometimes for a drink, occasionally for lunch when his schedule allowed. I began to notice changes in myself that were subtle but unmistakable. I paid more attention to music on the radio, found myself actually listening to lyrics instead of letting them wash over me as background noise. Colors seemed more vivid. The taste of food improved. It was as if Julian's presence in my life had recalibrated something fundamental, reminded my senses that the world contained more than obligation and routine. Clara noticed too, though she couldn't quite name what was different. She commented that I seemed more engaged at dinner, asked if something good had happened at work. I deflected these observations with vague references to feeling more energetic as the weather cooled, grateful that she didn't press for details I wasn't ready to examine myself. The shift came in early October. Clara had taken Sarah to visit colleges for the weekend, a mother-daughter trip they had been planning for months. Michael was back at school. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I had the house entirely to myself. Julian stopped by that Friday evening, unannounced. I had given him my address weeks earlier, though neither of us had acknowledged why. When I opened the door and saw him standing on my front porch, camera bag slung over his shoulder and a bottle of wine in his hand, something in my chest lifted and tightened simultaneously. I invited him in, gave him the tour he politely requested. He admired Clara's decorating, complimented the family photos, asked thoughtful questions about the children. But I could sense him taking in details that told a deeper story. The careful distance between Clara's reading chair and mine in the living room. The formal dining room that clearly saw little use. The studied perfection of rooms that looked lived in, but somehow lacked warmth. We ended up in my study, where Julian immediately gravitated toward the guitar. He picked it up carefully, as if it were a sleeping animal he didn't want to startle. The strings were badly out of tune, but he managed to coax a few recognizable chords from them, and the sound filled the small room with ghosts of all the music I had stopped making. "Play something," he said, offering me the guitar. I protested that I barely remembered how, that my fingers had lost whatever calluses and muscle memory they once possessed. But Julian was insistent, and finally I took the instrument, spent 10 frustrating minutes trying to tune it by ear, and stumbled through a song I had written senior year about leaving home and not knowing where you belonged. My voice was rusty and uncertain, my chord changes clumsy, but Julian listened as if I were performing at Carnegie Hall. When I finished, the silence in the room felt charged with recognition, with the weight of choices made and unmade, with the presence of selves we had buried but never quite forgotten. We talked until nearly midnight, the conversation ranging across decades and continents, touching on everything and nothing. Eventually, we moved to the living room, then somehow to my bedroom, where we lay fully clothed on top of the covers, the wine making us philosophical and unguarded. The rain had started sometime after 11, a steady percussion against the windows that seemed to wrap the house in its own private world. Julian was telling me about a photograph he had taken that afternoon, an abandoned gas station with weeds growing through cracks in the concrete, and how beautiful he had found it, that intersection of human ambition and natural reclamation. That was when he turned toward me, when the space between us became charged with something I couldn't name. That was when, without warning or ceremony, he reached across the small distance between us and touched my face with a gentleness that undid years of careful construction in a single gesture. In that moment, lying there in the amber light filtering through my bedroom window, I understood that some truths are too large for the containers we build to hold them. Some hunger's too deep for the lives we think we want. Julian left that night before anything more could happen, before either of us had to name what was stirring in the space between us. But his touch stayed with me, a phantom sensation that I carried into the following days like a secret burning beneath my skin. I couldn't stop thinking about it. The gentleness of his fingertips against my cheek, the way his eyes had held mine in that amber-lit moment. 3 seconds, maybe less, but it had cracked something open inside me that I had kept sealed for decades. In quiet moments at work, during the methodical routine of processing claims and updating files, I would find myself touching my own face, trying to recreate that feeling, that sudden sense of being truly seen. Everything began to change, slowly at first, then with gathering momentum. Colors seemed more saturated, as if someone had adjusted the brightness on the world itself. The coffee at Brewster's tasted richer. The autumn light filtering through my office window carried weight and texture I had never noticed before. It was as if Julian's presence had recalibrated my senses, reminded them that the world contained beauty worth paying attention to. Music affected me differently now. Songs on the radio that I had heard 100 times before suddenly revealed layers of meaning I had missed. Driving home from work, I would find myself actually listening to lyrics instead of letting them wash over me as background noise. A line about longing would catch me off guard, making my chest tighten with recognition. A melody would remind me of college, of late nights when Julian and I would dissect albums like literature students analyzing poetry. I started staying up later, sometimes sitting in my study after Clara and the children had gone to sleep, just listening. I discovered music streaming services, something that would have seemed impossibly futuristic in our college days, and spent hours following threads from one song to another, rediscovering artists we had loved and finding new ones that spoke to whatever was awakening in me. The guitar became a presence I could no longer ignore. One evening, when the house was quiet, I took it down from its place against the bookshelf and spent an hour restringing it, my fingers remembering the process despite decades of neglect. The new strings sang bright and clean when I tuned them, and I managed to play through 2 complete songs before my fingertips began to sting from lost calluses. Clara found me there the next morning, the guitar across my lap, sheet music scattered around my feet like fallen leaves. She paused in the doorway with her coffee mug, studying the scene with an expression I couldn't read. "You're playing again," she said, and there was something wistful in her voice that made me look up from the chord progression I had been attempting. "Just fooling around," I told her, trying to remember what I used to know. She nodded and moved on toward the kitchen, but I caught the way she glanced back, as if the sight of me with the guitar was both familiar and strange. like encountering an old photograph of someone you had almost forgotten you used to know. Julian and I began meeting more frequently. What had started as occasional coffee or drinks evolved into regular conversations that stretched across entire afternoons. He would text in the morning, something casual about having finished a shoot early or found an interesting bookstore, and I would find reasons to leave work, excuses that felt flimsy but somehow always worked. We talked about everything: art and loneliness and the weight of choices that shape a life. He told me stories from his years of traveling, small towns where he had documented fading industries and persistent hopes. The way he described his work, it was clear that photography had become more than a profession for him. It was a way of seeing, of bearing witness to beauty and loss in equal measure. I envied his certainty, the way he spoke about his calling with quiet conviction. When I asked if he had ever regretted choosing such an uncertain path, he was quiet for a long time before answering. He told me about the loneliness, about watching friends settle into conventional lives while he remained perpetually on the outside looking in, about wondering sometimes if he had been running from something rather than toward it. But then he would describe a particular photograph he had taken, a moment when light and subject and timing had aligned perfectly, and his face would transform. There was a joy in him that I recognized from our college days, an engagement with beauty that made everything around him seem more vivid. He never married. He told me one afternoon as we walked through a park near downtown. We had met for coffee that had turned into lunch that had turned into this aimless wandering through fallen leaves and late autumn light. There had been relationships, some serious, but nothing that survived the pull of his restless nature. I think I was afraid of becoming ordinary, he said, kicking at a pile of maple leaves. Afraid that settling down would mean settling for less than whatever it was I was really looking for. Did you find it? I asked. Whatever you were looking for. He stopped walking and looked at me with an intensity that made my pulse quicken. I'm still looking, he said. At home, the changes in me were becoming harder to disguise. Clara began asking if everything was all right, if something had happened at work or with friends that was making me distracted. I deflected these questions with reassurances that felt increasingly hollow. I told her I was just feeling more energetic, more engaged with life, but I could see the puzzlement in her eyes, the way she watched me when she thought I wasn't looking. The guilt was constant now, a low-level ache that colored every interaction with my family. I had not done anything wrong, not technically, but I felt like a stranger in my own house, someone playing the role of husband and father while my real attention was elsewhere. During dinner conversations, I would find my mind drifting to something Julian had said, some observation about light or storytelling that had struck me as particularly insightful. Sarah noticed, too, in the way teenagers do when the adults around them deviate from expected patterns. One evening she asked if I was having a midlife crisis, and the question was so direct, so casually perceptive, that I nearly choked on my coffee. I laughed it off, but her words stayed with me. Was that what this was? Some predictable phase that men my age went through when confronted with their own mortality and unfulfilled dreams. But it felt like more than that, deeper and more essential than a crisis. It felt like an awakening, like I was remembering who I had been before I learned to be so careful with my desires, so strategic about my choices. Julian's presence in my life was peeling away layers of accommodation and compromise, revealing hungers I had taught myself to ignore. Our conversations began to take on a different quality, more intimate and searching. We found ourselves talking about things I hadn't discussed with anyone in years. The loneliness of conventional success, the weight of living up to other people's expectations, the strange grief that comes from recognizing how much of yourself you have sacrificed for stability and respectability. Julian listened without judgment, without the need to offer solutions or reassurances. When I told him about feeling like a ghost in my own life, he nodded as if this were the most natural confession in the world. When I described the sensation of watching myself perform the role of contented suburbanite, while something essential withered inside, he understood with a precision that was both comforting and unsettling. The physical awareness between us was growing too, though neither of us acknowledged it directly. Conversations that might once have been purely intellectual now carried an undercurrent of something more primal. When Julian laughed at something I said, I found myself watching his mouth with an attention that felt dangerous. When he leaned forward to emphasize a point, I was aware of his proximity in ways that made my pulse quicken. There were moments when our hands would brush, reaching for the same menu, when he would touch my shoulder to get my attention, when the space between us would become charged with possibility. These touches lingered longer than they needed to, carried weight beyond their ostensible purpose. We were walking towards something neither of us had named, drawn by a gravity that felt both inevitable and terrifying. One evening in late October, Julian invited me to see some of his recent work. He was staying in a small apartment above an art supply store downtown, a temporary space he had rented while working on his project. The invitation felt significant, though I couldn't say exactly why. I told Clara I was meeting him for dinner, which was technically true, though I didn't mention that the dinner would be takeout eaten while looking at photographs in his temporary home. The lie felt heavier than usual, weighted with implications I wasn't ready to examine. Julian's apartment was sparse but thoughtful, furnished with a few pieces that looked like they had been carefully chosen rather than hastily acquired. His photographs covered one wall, black and white images that captured the dignity he had spoken about, the way abandoned places could hold beauty even in decay. But it was the intimacy of the space that affected me most. His camera equipment arranged with casual precision on a table by the window, books stacked beside the bed, their worn covers suggesting frequent reading, a coffee mug with a chip in the handle that somehow made it more endearing than perfect dishware would have been. We ate Chinese takeout while he walked me through his photographs, explaining his choices about light and composition with the kind of passion I remembered from our college conversations about literature and music. When he stood close to point out details in a particular image, I could smell his aftershave, could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. As the evening wore on, we moved to his small couch, continuing to talk, but with less structure now, the conversation flowing wherever our shared attention took it. Julian opened a bottle of wine, and the familiar loosening of inhibition that came with alcohol began to affect the careful distance we had been maintaining. When he told me about a photograph he had taken that morning, an old factory with windows like vacant eyes, he gestured with his hands to show me how the light had fallen across the brick facade. His enthusiasm was infectious, and I found myself leaning closer to better understand his vision, to see what he had seen. Our faces were inches apart when he stopped talking, when the silence stretched between us like a held breath. I could feel the warmth of his exhalation, could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes that I had somehow never noticed before. Time seemed to slow, each moment stretching into its component parts, and I knew with absolute certainty that I was standing at the edge of something irreversible, some choice that would divide my life into before and after. He raised his hand again, the same gesture from that night in my bedroom, his fingers hovering just short of my skin. But this time neither of us pulled away. This time, when Julian's fingers found my face, I didn't look away. His touch was tentative at first, a question rather than a statement, giving me space to retreat if I needed to. But I found myself leaning into that touch instead, closing my eyes and letting the sensation wash over me like recognition. We stayed like that for what felt like hours, but was probably only moments, his hand cradling my cheek, while I tried to process the rush of feelings his touch unleashed. It wasn't just desire, though that was part of it. It was something deeper and more frightening. The sudden understanding that this was what it felt like to be truly seen, truly known by another person. When I opened my eyes, Julian was watching me with an expression of such tenderness that my chest tightened. The careful distance we had been maintaining for weeks dissolved completely, and suddenly I was talking, words spilling out of me like water through a broken dam. I told him about the emptiness that had become my constant companion, the way I moved through my days feeling like an actor who had forgotten why the play mattered. I described the weight of living a life that looked successful from the outside but felt hollow at its core, the exhaustion that came from pretending to be grateful for things that left me numb. I talked about my marriage to Clara, how we had built something stable and functional but utterly lacking in passion, how we had become expert roommates rather than lovers. I confessed that I couldn't remember the last time we had touched each other with genuine desire rather than obligation. Couldn't recall a single conversation in recent years that had left me feeling energized rather than drained. Julian listened without interrupting, his thumb tracing slow circles on my cheekbone as I spoke. When I told him about the guitar gathering dust, about dreams I had abandoned so completely I could barely remember having them, his eyes filled with something that looked like grief. "I think I've been sleepwalking," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "For years, maybe decades, just going through the motions of what I thought a good life was supposed to look like." He was quiet for a long time after I finished speaking, his hand still resting against my face. When he finally replied, his voice carried the weight of understanding. "I used to wonder what happened to you," he said. "After college, after we lost touch. You were so alive then, so full of possibilities. When I saw you again that first day at the coffee shop, I thought maybe you had just settled into contentment. But watching you these past weeks, I could see it wasn't contentment at all." "What was it?" I asked, though I thought I knew the answer. "Resignation," he said. "You look like someone who had given up on being happy." The truth of his words hit me like a physical blow. I had given up on happiness, had convinced myself that contentment was enough, that wanting more was selfish and immature. I had traded passion for security, authenticity for approval, the messy uncertainty of following my heart for the clean predictability of doing what was expected. Julian's other hand came up to frame my face, and suddenly we were looking at each other with an intensity that made the air between us feel electric. I could see my own hunger reflected in his eyes, the same desperate need for connection that had been growing in me since that first night when he touched my cheek. "I should go," I whispered, but I made no move to leave. If anything, I leaned closer, drawn by a gravitational pull that felt stronger than reason or responsibility. "Should you?" he asked, and there was no pressure in the question, only invitation. Instead of answering with words, I closed the distance between us. The kiss was gentle at first, hesitant and questioning, both of us still offering the other a chance to pull away. But when Julian's lips moved against mine with growing certainty, something inside me broke open like a flower that had been waiting decades for the right season to bloom. I had forgotten what it felt like to be kissed with desire rather than duty, to feel someone's mouth against mine and know that they wanted to be there, that this contact was chosen rather than obligated. Julian kissed me like he had been thinking about it for weeks, like he was trying to communicate something that words couldn't hold. When we broke apart, both of us breathing unsteadily, I felt simultaneously exhilarated and terrified. The magnitude of what had just happened settled over me like a weight I wasn't sure I could carry. I was 48 years old, married for over 2 decades, the father of 2 nearly grown children. I lived in a house with a mortgage and a carefully maintained lawn and neighbors who waved when they saw me checking the mailbox. But in Julian's small apartment, with his photographs of beautiful decay watching from the walls and his books scattered across surfaces like evidence of a mind that stayed curious, I felt more like myself than I had in years. The kiss had awakened something I had taught myself to ignore, a hunger for authenticity that no amount of suburban comfort could satisfy. "I'm not young," I said, as if this needed to be acknowledged out loud. "I have responsibilities. People who depend on me." Julian nodded, his hand still resting on my face. "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to run away with me. I'm not asking you for anything except honesty about what this is." "What is it?" I asked, though I was afraid of the answer. He was quiet for a moment, considering. "For me, it's recognition," he said finally, "of something I felt in college but never had the courage to name, of a connection that I've been looking for in other people and other places ever since." His words echoed something I had been feeling but hadn't been able to articulate. Julian represented more than just attraction or even love. He represented the person I had been before I learned to be afraid of my own desires, before I confused respectability with happiness. I thought about Clara, probably asleep in our bed by now, trusting that I was where I had said I would be, doing what I had said I would do. I thought about Sarah and Michael, building their own lives with the assumption that their parents' marriage provided a stable foundation. I thought about the careful architecture of my suburban existence, all the ways I had constructed a life that looked admirable from the outside. And then I thought about how empty I felt most days, how I had been moving through that admirable life like a ghost haunting his own existence. How Julian's return had reminded me that there were other ways to live, other versions of myself that I had never allowed to breathe. The revelation wasn't simply that I was attracted to Julian, or even that I might love him in ways that complicated everything I thought I knew about myself. The revelation was bigger and more fundamental than that. For the first time in decades, I was feeling something real and urgent and undeniably alive. For the first time in years, I was experiencing what it meant to want something more than I feared the consequences of having it. Julian seemed to sense the weight of what I was processing. He pulled me closer, not to kiss me again, but simply to hold me. And I let myself sink into that embrace like someone who had been walking through a desert and had finally found water. We stayed like that as the evening deepened around us, holding each other while I tried to understand what this meant, where it could possibly lead. The practical part of my mind was already cataloging the obstacles, the complications, the ways this could destroy everything I had spent decades building. But for once, that practical voice felt distant and unconvincing. What felt real was Julian's warmth against me, the scent of his skin, the way being close to him made me feel both vulnerable and powerful simultaneously. What felt real was the understanding that I had been living only half a life, that authenticity was worth whatever price it demanded. When I finally pulled away and looked into Julian's eyes, I saw my own transformation reflected there. Whatever happened next, whatever choices I would have to make, I could never go back to the sleepwalking existence I had accepted for so long. The man who would drive home to Maple Street that night was not the same man who had arrived at Julian's apartment that evening. Something fundamental had shifted. Some wall had come down that could never be rebuilt. I was awake now, fully and terrifyingly awake, and there was no returning to the comfortable numbness I had mistaken for peace. The days that followed were suffused with a tension so thick I could barely breathe through it. I moved through my house like a stranger, hyper-aware of every sound, every gesture, every word that passed between Clara and me. The kiss lingered on my lips like evidence that anyone could see, and I found myself touching my mouth unconsciously, remembering the weight of Julian's hands on my face. Sleep became elusive. I would lie beside Clara in our bed, listening to her steady breathing while my mind raced through the implications of what had happened. The familiar weight of her presence, which had once been comforting in its predictability, now felt like an accusation. She trusted me completely, had built her life around the assumption of my faithfulness, and I had shattered that foundation with a single kiss in a small apartment downtown. The guilt was overwhelming, but what frightened me more was how right it had felt. In Julian's arms, I had experienced something I hadn't even realized I was missing. The sensation of being desired for who I actually was rather than who I appeared to be. The kiss had awakened hungers I had spent decades learning to ignore, and now those hungers followed me everywhere, making ordinary moments feel charged with impossibility. Clara began to notice my distraction almost immediately. Over breakfast, she would ask questions that required more than yes or no answers, and I would find myself staring at her blankly, my thoughts still tangled up in memories of Julian's mouth against mine. She started studying me with the careful attention she usually reserved for crossword puzzles, as if I were a problem that could be solved through patient observation. The children noticed too, in the way that children do when the adults around them begin to deviate from expected patterns. Sarah asked one morning if I was feeling sick, and the concern in her voice made my chest tighten with shame. Michael called from college that weekend, and when I handed the phone to Clara after a brief conversation, I caught her telling him that I had seemed stressed about work lately. Everything was fine. But everything was not fine. I was walking through my life like someone trying not to disturb a house of cards, terrified that any sudden movement would bring everything crashing down. At the office, I made mistakes that I had to correct later, simple errors that revealed how little of my attention was actually focused on processing insurance claims. My colleagues began to look at me with the same puzzled concern I was getting at home. Julian texted me twice in those first few days, casual messages about meeting for coffee or lunch. I didn't respond to either, paralyzed by the weight of what communication with him would mean. To see him again would be to acknowledge what had happened between us, to confront the choice that was waiting for me like a cliff edge I couldn't avoid forever. But Julian was patient in ways that made his absence even more painful. He didn't call repeatedly or show up at my house or force confrontations I wasn't ready for. Instead, he gave me space to process, to wrestle with the implications of what we had discovered in each other. His restraint felt like another form of caring, evidence that he understood the magnitude of what I was facing. Still, the silence between us felt unsustainable. After a week of avoiding his messages, of jumping every time my phone buzzed, I finally called him. We met at a park on the edge of town, away from places where we might encounter anyone I knew, walking slowly along paths that meandered through late autumn trees. Julian looked tired, older somehow than he had the week before. When he asked how I was doing, I couldn't find words adequate to describe the turmoil I was living with. I told him I felt like I was drowning, like every breath required conscious effort. He listened without trying to fix anything, walking beside me with his hands in his jacket pockets while I struggled to articulate what was happening inside me. When I told him I didn't know how to move forward, didn't know how to reconcile what I was feeling with the life I had built, he nodded as if this were exactly what he had expected me to say. "I'm not asking you to leave your family," he said finally, stopping near a bench overlooking a small pond. "I know what that would cost you, what it would cost them. But I can't pretend that nothing has changed between us either. I can't go back to casual coffee conversations and safe topics when I know what it feels like to kiss you." His honesty was both a relief and a torment. Part of me had hoped he would make this easier, would either pressure me to choose him or release me from the obligation of choosing it all. Instead, he was asking me to face the truth of what I wanted, to stop hiding from myself behind obligations and fears. "You have to decide who you want to be," he continued, his voice gentle but unwavering. "Not who other people need you to be, not who you think you should be, but who you actually are underneath all the roles you've been playing." That conversation stayed with me as the days stretched into weeks. I found myself studying my reflection in mirrors, looking for signs of the person Julian saw, the authentic self I had buried beneath decades of careful accommodation. Sometimes I caught glimpses of him, usually in moments when I wasn't trying so hard to be what everyone expected. But mostly I saw a middle-aged man who looked tired and lost, someone who had forgotten how to want anything beyond the approval of others. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening in November. Clara was preparing dinner while I sat at the kitchen table, sorting through mail that I wasn't really reading. Sarah was upstairs doing homework, music playing softly from her room. It was the kind of ordinary domestic scene that should have felt peaceful, evidence of a well-functioning family life. But sitting there, watching Clara move efficiently through familiar routines, I felt like I was suffocating. The weight of pretending that everything was normal had become unbearable. Every smile I forced, every casual conversation about weekend plans or Sarah's college applications, felt like a betrayal of something essential inside me. Clara must have sensed my distress because she turned from the stove and really looked at me for the first time in days. Her face, familiar and kind and tired in ways I hadn't noticed before, showed a mixture of concern and something that might have been fear. "Nathaniel," she said, setting down the wooden spoon she had been using to stir pasta sauce. "We need to talk." Those words hung in the air between us like a challenge I couldn't avoid. I knew what she was seeing when she looked at me, the distance that had opened up, the way I had been moving through our shared life like a ghost haunting familiar spaces. She deserved honesty, even if I couldn't offer her the complete truth. "I know something's wrong," she continued, taking the seat across from me at our kitchen table. "You've been different for weeks. Distracted. Distant. If something's happening at work, if you're worried about money or your health or anything else, you can tell me." The kindness in her voice made everything worse. She was offering me explanations that would preserve our life together, safe harbors where I could anchor my distress without destroying what we had built. But I couldn't take shelter in those lies anymore. Couldn't pretend that what was happening inside me could be solved with reassurance or practical solutions. I looked at her across the table where we had shared thousands of meals, where we had made plans and solved problems and celebrated the children's achievements. She was a good woman who had loved me as fully as she knew how, who had built a stable life around the assumption that I was content with the choices we had made together. "It's not work," I said finally, my voice sounding strange in my own ears. "It's not anything you can fix or that we can solve together." Clara's face went very still. I could see her processing my words, understanding that I was telling her something fundamental had shifted, something that threatened the foundation of everything we had constructed. "I can't keep living this way," I continued, the words coming out in a rush before I could lose courage. "I know how that sounds. I know it's not fair to you or to the children. But something inside me has changed, and I can't pretend it hasn't." She was quiet for a long time, her hands folded on the table between us. When she finally spoke, her voice was careful, controlled. "Is there someone else?" The directness of the question caught me off guard. I had expected anger or confusion, demands for explanation or reassurance. Instead, she was asking for the truth with a precision that suggested she already knew what the answer would be. I couldn't lie to her, not with her looking at me like that, not when she was being brave enough to ask the question that would change everything between us. But I couldn't tell her the complete truth either, couldn't explain about Julian and what his return had awakened in me. "Yes," I said, the single word falling between us like a stone into still water. "But it's more complicated than that." Clara nodded slowly, as if this confirmation was somehow easier to bear than continued uncertainty. The weight of her unspoken understanding filled the room, heavy and final and sad beyond measure. We sat there in our kitchen, surrounded by the ordinary markers of our shared life, while everything we had built together quietly collapsed around us. The conversation with Clara didn't end in shouting or tears or dramatic declarations. It ended in silence, both of us sitting at our kitchen table while the pasta sauce simmered on the stove and Sarah's music drifted down from upstairs, oblivious to the way her world was quietly reshaping itself around her. Clara asked no more questions that night. She didn't demand details or explanations or promises about what would happen next. Instead, she stood up and returned to preparing dinner, moving through the familiar motions with a careful precision that spoke louder than any words could have. We ate together as a family, discussing Sarah's upcoming college visits and Michael's plans for winter break, maintaining the surface rituals of normal life even as everything beneath shifted fundamentally. The following weeks passed in a strange suspended state. Clara and I navigated our shared spaces with exquisite politeness, like diplomats from countries that had declared an uneasy peace. We discussed practical matters, schedules, finances, Sarah's needs, but avoided anything that might require us to acknowledge what was actually happening between us. I moved into the guest room without ceremony, claiming insomnia and not wanting to disturb her sleep. She accepted this explanation with the same careful neutrality she brought to all our interactions now. Sometimes I would catch her watching me with an expression I couldn't read, something that might have been grief or relief or both. Julian and I continued to meet, but less frequently now, and always with the weight of what had been set in motion hanging between us. He never asked about my conversation with Clara, never pressed for updates on decisions I was still learning how to make. Instead, he waited with the kind of patience that felt like love itself, letting me find my own way toward whatever truth I was capable of claiming. Sarah sensed the change in our household dynamics, asking questions that Clara and I deflected with vague references to stress and busy schedules. But teenagers are perceptive in ways that adults forget, and I could see her watching us with growing concern, trying to decode the careful distance that had opened up between her parents. Michael called from college one evening, and I could hear Clara in the kitchen, her voice strained as she reassured him that everything was fine, just some adjustments as Sarah prepared for her senior year. The lie sat heavy in the house after she hung up, one more weight in the careful architecture of denial we were constructing. As December approached, The pretense became unsustainable. Clara and I could no longer maintain the fiction that we were simply going through a rough patch. That time and patience would restore whatever had been disrupted. The truth was too large now, had taken up too much space in our shared life to be ignored or managed away. One evening, as I sat in my study looking at the guitar I had been playing more frequently, Clara appeared in the doorway. She watched me for a moment, taking in the sheet music scattered across my desk, the evidence of something awakening in me that she had no part in. "I'll stay through the holidays," she said quietly, "for Sarah's sake. But after that, we need to figure out what comes next." I nodded, understanding that this was not a negotiation but a statement of fact. Clara had always been practical, able to see situations clearly even when they were painful. She was offering me a gift of time, a chance to navigate this transition without destroying Sarah's senior year or the family rituals that had defined our Decembers together. Christmas came and went with carefully maintained traditions. Michael returned from college, and for a few weeks we inhabited the roles of intact family with skill born of decades of practice. We opened presents and shared meals and attended Sarah's winter concert, sitting together in the school auditorium while our daughter sang carols with the kind of unself-conscious joy that made my chest ache. But underneath the familiar rhythms, everything had changed. Clara and I moved through our shared spaces like polite strangers, maintaining appearances while privately preparing for the inevitable dissolution of what we had built together. The children sensed it, I was sure, but they seemed to have made an unspoken agreement to preserve the fiction for as long as possible. Julian left town between Christmas and New Year's, a planned trip to see his sister in Portland. Before he went, we met one last time at the park where we had walked that difficult afternoon in November. The trees were bare now, skeletal against a gray sky that promised snow. "Take your time," he told me, his hands warm on my shoulders as we stood beside the pond. "I'm not going anywhere, not really. Whatever you decide, whenever you decide it, I'll be here." His words carried no pressure, no ultimatum, just the quiet assurance that some connections transcend geography and timing, that what we had discovered in each other would survive whatever choices lay ahead. When he kissed me goodbye, it felt like both an ending and a beginning, a completion of one chapter and the uncertain opening of another. The house felt different after the holidays, emptied of the forced cheer we had all worked so hard to maintain. Sarah returned to school, Michael to college, and Clara and I found ourselves alone together in a way that made the end feel both inevitable and immediate. We sat down on a Tuesday evening in late January, the same kitchen table where we had shared that first honest conversation months before. This time, the discussion was purely practical. Division of assets, custody arrangements for Sarah's remaining months at home, the logistics of untangling a life we had spent over 2 decades building together. Clara was fair in ways that made the process more painful rather than less. She asked for nothing beyond what she needed, made no demands for explanations or apologies. Her generosity felt like forgiveness, even though neither of us used that word. The night I finally moved out, I stood alone in our bedroom for the last time. Clara was staying with her sister, giving me space to pack without the weight of her presence. Sarah was at a friend's house, avoiding the awkwardness of watching her father load boxes into his car. The room looked smaller without my belongings in it, more clearly Clara's space than it had ever been. I could see evidence of her solitary life beginning to emerge in the arrangement of books on her nightstand, the way she had spread her clothes across both sides of the closet. I walked to the dresser and looked down at my wedding ring, the gold band that had lived on my finger for 22 years. It had worn thin in places, marked by decades of daily wear, of washing dishes and changing diapers, and all the small gestures that make up a shared life. I slipped it off slowly, feeling the strange lightness of its absence. For a moment I held it in my palm, this small circle that had once represented everything I thought I wanted. Then I set it gently on Clara's dresser, leaving it where she would find it when she returned, a final acknowledgement of what we had been to each other and what we could no longer be. The apartment I rented was small and temporary, a place to land while I figured out what came next. It had a single bedroom, a kitchen barely large enough for one person, and windows that looked out onto a street I didn't recognize. Julian helped me move the few belongings I had taken, working quietly beside me as we carried boxes up 2 flights of stairs. That first night in my new space, I lay alone in an unfamiliar bed, staring at a ceiling that held no memories. The silence was different here, not the comfortable quiet of a house settling into its rhythms, but the blank silence of possibility. Everything around me was temporary, provisional, waiting to be decided. I raised my hand to my cheek, remembering Julian's touch from that October night that had started everything. The gesture felt different now, not like trying to recapture something lost, but like acknowledging something found. For the first time in decades, I was alone not because I was lonely, but because I was learning how to be myself without the framework of other people's expectations. My breathing was uneven, uncertain, like someone learning to use lungs that had been constricted for too long. But it was my breath, finally, authentic and unguarded. The future stretched ahead of me, blank and terrifying and full of choices I would have to make without the safety net of convention or obligation. Julian would return from Portland soon. Sarah would graduate and leave for college. Clara would build a new life that didn't require her to pretend that what we had was enough. And I would learn, day by day, what it meant to live from the inside out rather than the outside in. The silence in my small apartment wasn't empty. It was full of possibility, heavy with the weight of choices I was finally ready to make. Not because they were safe or expected or approved of by others, but because they were true. Because for the first time in my adult life, I was beginning to understand the difference.